In Nairobi, hundreds of Kenyans march against corruption. Doctors race to vaccinate 1,000 people in Congo against Ebola. And the Kim-Trump summit takes place, but not the one you're thinking of. Africa 54 starts right now.
Good evening, I'm Esther Gidui. You watch in for Vincent Makori. This is Africa 54. More than 200 demonstrators have marched through the streets of Kenya's capital, Nairobi, to protest what they say are high levels of corruption. Authorities have promised to investigate 10 financial institutions suspected of handling funds that were stolen from the government's National Youth Service. Central Bank Governor Patrick Njoroge says a number of lenders are under investigation. Officials are trying to trace the recipients of the missing funds. Dozens of senior officials and business people face charges related to the theft of nearly $100 million. The Director of Criminal Investigations, George Kinoti, says 9 commercial banks and a financial cooperative society are also under investigation. The Central African Republic has approved a law that will create a special criminal court to investigate allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity during more than a decade of ethnic and religious conflict. The United Nations Deputy Representative in the CAR says the tribunal, which will be composed of both national and international judges, would begin formal investigations next week. Rights activists say hundreds of people have died in the violence and scores more have been raped and tortured, but the perpetrators have not been brought to justice. The CAR has suffered a series of violent political crises since former President Francois Bozize seized power in a 2003 coup. Major violence erupted again in 2013 when mainly Muslim Seleka rebels ousted Bozize, prompting reprisals from mostly Christian militias. The United Nations says the litany of killings, rapes, mutilation, looting and torture committed by successive governments and armed groups from 2003 to 2015 may constitute crimes against humanity. Human rights activists say countless women and girls who were living in internally displaced persons camps in northeast Nigeria have been lured to other countries under false pretenses for sex work and slave labor. A new campaign is trying to educate women about their dangers. In Maiduguri, Chika Odua went out with the campaigners and interviewed 2 women who were trafficked abroad and who are now back in Nigeria.
Activists are hitting the streets of Maiduguri to warn people about the dangers of human trafficking. These are people who have come to Maiduguri to run away from the terrorist group Boko Haram. But even in Maiduguri, where they found refuge, other dangers lurk. Human traffickers are seducing IDPs, internally displaced persons, using false promises of employment.
So later on, when they carry them out, then later they will not even give them the job. Then they will start selling them like slaves. And we have some victims. After we starting this campaign, we got some victims that they have occurred they face these challenges.
Nana Abdullahi, an orphan, was selling goods on Maiduguri streets to make money when she met a man who said he could help her.
I told him I would like a job so that I can take care of myself. He said okay, and he took me. I thought we were going someplace like Kano, but when we got there, he went all the way with me to Niger.
After a month of what she described as an ordeal, Nana ran away and found her way back to Nigeria. More than 1 million IDPs live in Maiduguri, the capital of northeastern Nigeria's Borno State. This is where Boko Haram started, launching attacks across the region that have so far killed more than 30,000 people. There are about a dozen IDP camps in the city, and the government says they are frequent targets for traffickers.
People are coming there in the evening for recruiting, I can say, taking young girls, going away with them.
Members of Nigeria's anti-trafficking agency distribute pamphlets to warn of the dangers. But some say their choices in Maiduguri are limited. Mariam Haruna was smuggled into Saudi Arabia, where she worked illegally as a domestic helper.
I spent 2 years there working. Unfortunately, one day when I was coming back from work, I got caught and was deported back home.
Despite having to pay back the man who trafficked her, Mariam says she would rather go back to Saudi Arabia because her life there was better than her life here. But these activists hope she goes back legally. They say people who have suffered and survived Boko Haram attacks should not have to fall victim again to human traffickers. Chika Odua in Maiduguri, Nigeria, for VOA News.
A conflict in the Tanganyika province of the Democratic Republic of Congo has displaced over 630,000 people from their homes over the past year, forcing parents to send their children to work as sand miners. Faced with poverty, hunger, and disease, children as young as 5 years old are seen harvesting sand from the shores of Lake Tanganyika. The children make 30 US cents for every 25 kilograms of sand used for construction. The United Nations says Congo's Tanganyika province has seen a sharp escalation of violence since late last year, with new armed groups forming. There's also been an increase in the use of firearms. The conflict is part of a worsening humanitarian crisis in Congo. Militia violence has risen since President Joseph Kabila refused to step down after his constitutional mandate expired in 2016. According to the International Labour Organization, nearly half of the children in forced labor do hazardous work, and more than a third do not go to school. After years of turmoil, many Ethiopians believe a new era of hope has dawned in the East African country. VOA's Paul Sisko has more.
The East African country remains in a state of emergency following a years-long crackdown on opposition political activity. The announcement of another state of emergency came one day after former Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn resigned. Ethiopia is crucial to the stability of East Africa. It has the region's largest army, the continent's fastest-growing economy, and it is surrounded by disenfranchised states, including Somalia, Sudan, and South Sudan, and Eritrea. It is a highly centralized state with only the ruling party and its allies in parliament. On April 10th, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a resolution urging the Ethiopian government to increase its respect for human rights and the rule of law. Human rights groups say security forces have killed hundreds of activists, protesters, and dissident journalists, jailing many thousands more. In the last year, the ruling parties also released thousands of political prisoners, closed the notorious Makalela prison, and changed its leadership, replacing Haile Mariam Desalegn with now Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. The 42-year-old took office on April 2nd. Eskinder Nega is a journalist and one of the recently released political prisoners. Nega spent more than 6 years in jail, has been in and out 8 times, and was convicted by the government of treason and terrorism.
Well, this is an African prison, so you could guess how it would be. But overall, I think the objective of the imprisonment was more than physical imprisonment. The objective is to break the spirit, and that's not specifically against me, but against all prisoners, particularly political prisoners. And in the final analysis, it did not happen. That's why I'm sitting here.
He confirms the frequent use of torture by prison authorities and that tens of thousands of others were also jailed.
Like you said, I was in prison 8 times, and during those times, there were times when I was tortured. So there is torture in Ethiopia's prisons.
The new prime minister hails from the Oromo community. Violent protests by the Oromos, Ethiopia's largest ethnic group, and persistent unrest from the Amharas, the second largest ethnic community, continue, even as the new prime minister travels the region calling for unity and promising reforms. Zaid Raed Al-Hussein is the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Well, it's unlikely in any transition for it to be smooth. There will always be bumps in the road. There may be setbacks. There's a sense of great anticipation, but maybe trepidation as well. And so hope comes with a little anxiety.
Human rights groups routinely accuse Ethiopia of clamping down on opposition candidates and supporters, as well as journalists, by using anti-terrorism laws to silence dissent and jail government critics. Meanwhile, there is cautious optimism, strife, and a glimmer of hope in East Africa, and with the Ethiopian diaspora, that maybe the time for change has come, even as returning drought, combined with the displacement of hundreds of thousands, have put millions of Ethiopians in desperate need of food aid. Paul Sisko, VOA News, Washington.
You're watching Africa 54. In a moment, racing against time to control the spread of Ebola in the DRC. But first, here's a recap of Wednesday's headlines.
In Kenya, demonstrators staged protests across the country amid a surge in the number of cases of high-level corruption. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, children as young as 5 years old, displaced by violence from the Tanganyika province, are being put to work as sand miners to help support their parents. In Libya, 150 Somali migrants returned voluntarily to their home country with transportation organized by the UN after several months of confinement in government-run detention centers in Libya. We stay in that country where illegal migrants break their Ramadan fast at an immigration detention center in the capital, Tripoli. Finally, the non-governmental organization Save the Children says in its latest report that half of the world's children live in poverty.
And joining us now is Africa 54 health correspondent Lenore Mudu with a report on the battle against Ebola. Lenore?
Hello, Esther. Hello, everyone. The World Health Organization says fewer people are smoking worldwide, especially women, but only 1 country in 8 is on track to meet a target of reducing tobacco use significantly by 2025. In a new global report on trends in prevalence of tobacco smoking, the WHO says 3 million people die prematurely each year due to tobacco use, which causes cardiovascular diseases, including heart attacks and stroke. About 890,000 of deaths result from secondhand smoke exposure. Progress is uneven, with the Americas being the only region set to meet the UN target of reducing tobacco use by 30% by 2025. Douglas Betcher is director of the WHO's Department for the Prevention of Non-Communicable Diseases.
And as the report explains, only 1 in 8 countries is on track to meet the voluntary global target to reduce tobacco use. And one of the major factors impeding low and middle income countries, certainly countries face resistance from a tobacco industry that wishes to replace clients who die by freely marketing their products and keeping prices affordable for young people.
The World Health Organization says the trends report further shows that prevalence of tobacco smoking has decreased from 27% in 2000 compared to 20% in 2016. Now, health workers in the Democratic Republic of Congo are racing against time to contain an outbreak of Ebola. So far, the World Health Organization reports at least 25 people have died out of the 58 people who have gotten the virus. VOA's Carol Pearson reports that efforts to vaccinate people exposed to Ebola started more than 10 days ago.
People in Bikoro celebrate this man's recovery from Ebola. Mwangi Nondi says he developed a fever after caring for his brother who died from Ebola. But Nondi is better now after receiving the Ebola vaccine. Doctors in Congo say they have not been able to vaccinate everyone who has been exposed to the virus, and they're still finding new cases that are not linked to cases they have already confirmed. This means the virus is still actively spreading, and health workers still don't have an accurate picture of what's going on. Congo's vaccination campaign is targeting more than 1,000 health workers, along with those who have had contact with people who developed the virus. They use a ring approach, where health workers identify newly diagnosed Ebola patients and then set out locating people they've been in contact with, from family and friends to neighbors and work colleagues. The vaccine they're using was developed during the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. It's not licensed yet, but it has proven to be safe and effective.
What it does, it teaches the immune system to recognize those Ebola proteins on the surface of this modified virus, and in doing so, create a protective response against that.
Because the vaccine can only be tested when there's an Ebola outbreak, there are many unknowns.
What we're trying to do now is to establish how effective is this vaccine. Do you need 1 dose or 2 doses to be protective? And once you've been injected or vaccinated with this, how long does that protection last for as well?
Containing the virus is difficult because many areas impacted by the outbreak are close to heavily used waterways. It started in rural Bikoro, then moved to Mbandaka, a busy port city along the Congo River. People used the river to bring produce to the country's capital, Kinshasa. Health workers say keeping Ebola out of heavily populated areas is critical to containing this outbreak. Carol Pearson, VOA News, Washington.
Now to Malawi, where a team of veterinarians have traveled to the southern part of the country to vaccinate thousands of dogs as part of a global effort by the British charity Mission Rabies to eradicate the deadly virus by 2030. Malawi has in the past reported elevated numbers of child deaths from rabies, but now, 3 years into the initiative, the organizers say they are seeing signs of progress. Lamek Masina reports from VOA from Blantyre.
Another massive vaccination campaign is underway in Malawi. The goal is to eradicate rabies in the African country. Dog bites are the source of nearly all rabies infections in humans. Mission Rabies has vaccinated about 250,000 dogs in Malawi since 2015.
We only had 1 person dying from within Blantyre city in 2017. So we did really have a big decrease in the number of rabies cases, but we also know it is an underreported disease. So often people wouldn't know what their child actually died of. Cerebral malaria is one of the diseases that can look very similar. So there are possibly more cases, but there has been a big decrease.
Mission Rabies swung into action after researchers reported in 2012 that 5 children had died of rabies in just 3 months at a single hospital in southern Malawi, the highest toll of any institution on the continent. Even when rabies infection is identified, clinics in Malawi often lack the necessary drugs to treat it. So this initiative has 2 aims: prevent dogs from getting infected and prevent children from getting bit. The team shows children how to avoid a dog attack and what actions to take if bitten by a potentially rabid dog.
We target children because most of the times children tend to stay close to dogs and play with them. And mostly they don't know what to do once they are bitten by the dog.
More than 1 million school children and their teachers have benefited from the lessons.
Even myself, I didn't even know that I should not disturb a dog who is eating. I have learned it today at this school.
The latest vaccination drive began in April. It's a job that is not without its challenges. With the owner's consent, the dogs are also sterilized.
Because if all the dogs that we vaccinate today, if they go off and have lots of puppies, all those puppies are unvaccinated, and then that dilutes the vaccination.
Mission Rabies aims to one day vaccinate at least 70% of dogs nationwide. Lamek Masina for VOA News, Blantyre, Malawi.
And that's our health report for today. To stay in touch, find me on Twitter at Lenore Moudou. Esther, back to you.
And thank you, Lenore, for joining us today. Be sure to watch for Lenore Moudou every Tuesday and Thursday for the latest health news in Africa, right here on Africa 54. Welcome back to Africa 54. Here's what's trending. America's capital was abuzz over yesterday's Kim-Trump summit. No, not that one. Kim Kardashian West met with President Donald Trump in the Oval Office Wednesday. The reality star has urged Trump to pardon 63-year-old Alice Marie Johnson, who is serving a life sentence without parole for a non-violent drug offense. While Kardashian supported Hillary Clinton during the 2016 presidential campaign, her husband Kanye West has been vocal in his support of the president and even had a meeting with him while Trump was campaigning. Next up, a robotic bird of prey that convincingly mimics the flight of a real peregrine falcon has been developed to help tackle the problem of bird strikes at airports. Bird strikes are common during commercial flights, and experts say material damage is a billion-dollar problem to the aviation industry. Dutch company Clear Flight Solutions says its RoBird robot can help scare birds away from air traffic and discourage nesting near runways. It's also being used by the agricultural industry to stop crops being eaten. So far, the RoBird has been deployed at several airports around the world, and that's what's trending today. Now, George Leonard is the chief scientist for Ocean Conservancy, an environmental advocacy group that focuses on keeping the Earth's ocean and all that depend on it healthy. He recently spoke with VOA's Rebecca Ward and Rick Pantaleo, telling them the ocean is in distress due to three major factors: acidification, climate change, and man-made debris like plastics. It was also the latter that recently prompted Leonard to take part in a research expedition to St. Helena off the coast of southern Africa to study the effects of plastics on marine life. His experience shows a disturbing trend that is not only unsightly, but dangerous to the health of one of the world's most precious resources.
You can find plastic pretty much everywhere in the ocean nowadays. You can find it in the open ocean, the deep sea, up along the beaches, and even in the remote areas of the Arctic. We were at St. Helena because we had an opportunity to do some research there with a colleague of ours, Dr. Al Dove, who's the Vice President for Conservation and Research at Georgia Aquarium. And he studies whale sharks, and at Ocean Conservancy, we focus on plastics. Whale sharks are a fascinating animal, marine animal. They are the largest fish in the sea. They're called whale sharks, but they're not whales. They're actually sharks. And they filter feed the water, which means they don't eat with teeth. They eat by filtering small animals, small fish, and phytoplankton and zooplankton at the very bottom of the food web. And because plastic in the ocean is often in these very, very small particles, there's this increasing worry that animals like whale sharks and some other fish and other whales can actually filter this material out of the ocean and become impacted by plastics. So at present, we think there's about 8 million metric tons of plastic that comes into the ocean every year. That's equivalent to about one garbage truck full of plastic being dumped into the ocean somewhere around the world every minute. So it's a pretty large number. At Ocean Conservancy, we facilitated a scientific working group a number of years ago that published that work in Science, which is one of the most prestigious journals out there, received a lot of attention and has really focused much of the conversation on where that material is coming from, which is mostly from land, and most of it is coming, about half of it is coming from half a dozen countries in Southeast Asia. The waste management system in St. Helena is quite sophisticated. It's as a British territory, they've made some pretty major investments in their system in the last 10 years or so. And so we don't think that much of what's on their beaches is actually coming from the local populace. But because of where they're situated in the South Atlantic and the way the winds blow, a lot of material is coming from offshore, and a lot of that is fishing related. There's a lot of ropes and buoys and light sticks, a variety of things from offshore, probably foreign fishing vessels is what we think. And then there's a whole sort of ton of water bottles and other materials that are branded that have languages that are not English and corporate brands that are not sold in the local marketplace in St. Helena. So we know that those are coming from elsewhere. But it is absolutely true that you can solve your own marine debris problem locally, but still have a problem because it's coming from elsewhere. At Ocean Conservancy, we have, for 30 years now, organized the International Coastal Cleanup, which has become the largest volunteer effort on behalf of the global ocean. And every September, the third Saturday in September, people from all over the world now come out in lots of countries, up to 150 countries and states, from North America to South America, through Europe, and into Southeast Asia and Australia. So we do a lot of work to get the message out by working with partners all over the world to bring people out to clean up their beach and to learn about the issue. That's one major way that we kind of get the word out there about plastics.
In today's energy-hungry world, scientists are constantly revisiting every renewable resource as they look for ways to increase efficiency. One researcher in the Netherlands believes even gravity can be harnessed to produce free electricity on a scale sufficient to power small appliances. VOA's George Butich has more.
When exposed to mechanical stress, certain materials such as quartz crystals and some ceramics produce tiny amounts of electricity. This effect, called piezoelectricity, is used in barbecue lighters to create a spark that lights up the flame. It is also used to create audio signals in crystal phono cartridges and crystal microphones. But piezoelectricity only works when the applied force changes from pressure to release and back. Gravity, on the other hand, is a constant force.
The problem with gravity is that it's always pushing in one manner.
Dutch architect Jan-Jaap Roossenaars noticed that when a long vertical pole attached to a base plate is pushed out of balance, it tends to wobble for a long time, applying intermittent pressure on the edges of the base plate.
So the actual invention that you're looking at here, the gravity energy device, is introducing change. So once gravity is being transformed into a changing thing, then you can generate electricity, and that's what you're seeing here.
Piezoelectric material inserted between the wobbling base plate and the solid ground is exposed to constantly increasing and relaxing pressure, thus creating electricity.
With very little input, we get instability in this system. Gravity takes over.
The wobbling of the pole can be produced even when the hot air created by a lamp starts turning a small rotor on its top.
It's really so new that we still have to discover what is the most optimal, but it's indefinite or infinite, basically, how many piezo material you can add to it.
Roossenaars says the same principle could be applied on a larger scale for charging car batteries or in standalone electricity generators. George Butich, VOA News.
And that's our show for today. Good night from Washington.
Welcome to English in a Minute. You know the difference between a left foot and a right foot. But what does it mean if you say someone has
2 left feet?
Maybe our 2 friends, Anna and Jonathan, can help us?
Jonathan, what happened to your head?
Well, I've been taking these dance lessons with my new friend.
Were you dancing on your head?